In the history of the Gilded Age, there is a specific archetype that haunts the ballrooms of Europe, the dollar princess. She is usually young, beautiful, and comes with a dowry large enough to rebuild a castle. But Nancy Stewart was different. She wasn't young. She was 40 years old. She wasn't a blushing virgin. She was a widow twice over. And her money didn't come from old land or respectable banking. It came from the soot and grime of the American tin plate industry. To the starving aristocrats of Europe, Nancy Stewart was a walking paradox. She was the solution to their bankruptcy, but she was also the embodiment of their deepest fears. She represented a world where bloodlines didn't matter, only bank balances did. Before buying the crown, she was simply Nancy, a woman living on a mountain of gold, seeking something money couldn't buy: respect. We'll explore the origins of the fortune that captivated a prince. We'll see how a girl from Ohio became America's richest widow, and why her fatal weakness, her desire to belong to a class that despised her, set the stage for one of the most humiliating deals in royal history. The disdain Nancy faced in the European courts was rooted deeply in her origins. Born in Zanesville, Ohio in 1878, she hailed from a place that, to a Grand Duke in St. Petersburg or a king in Athens, might as well have been another planet. This was the heartland of the new industrial America, loud, dirty, productive, and unapologetically commercial. While her father was a wealthy merchant, the colossal fortune that would eventually shake the foundations of the Greek monarchy came from her second husband, William B. Leeds. William Leeds was the tin plate king. Tin plate is not glamorous, it is industrial. It smells of factories, sweat, and machinery. In the rigid hierarchy of the late 19th century, money had a smell. Old money smelled of horses, leather, and damp earth. New money smelled of coal and metal. When Nancy married Leeds, she entered the stratosphere of American wealth. They were part of the new aristocracy of steel and rail that was replacing the old gentry. But even in New York, the Leeds fortune was considered nouveau. It was too new, too fast, too liquid. Nancy learned early on that having money was not the same as having status. You could buy the mansion on Fifth Avenue, but you couldn't force the old Knickerbocker families to invite you to dinner. This early rejection in America planted the seed of her fatal weakness, an obsession with legitimacy. She wanted to be more than just rich. She wanted to be noble. There's a dark undercurrent to Nancy's early life that adds a layer of tragedy to her biography. She was a woman surrounded by death. Her first husband, George Worthington, died early. Her second husband, the tin plate king William Leeds, died in 1908 in Paris. By the age of 30, Nancy was a double widow. In the superstitious circles of high society, this marked her. She was seen as unlucky, or worse, as a black widow. But financially, these deaths transformed her. When William Leeds died, he left Nancy a fortune estimated at $40 million. She was suddenly one of the wealthiest women in the world. She was youngish, beautiful, and unfathomably rich, but she was also alone. Imagine Nancy Stewart, dressed in the heavy black mourning silks of the Edwardian era, sitting in a suite at the Ritz in Paris, holding a bank book that could buy a small country. She had everything, and she had nothing. She had no husband to define her status. She had a son, but she was largely adrift in the social ocean of Europe. It was at this precise moment, rich, lonely, and ambitious, that she became the perfect target for the royal hunters. What happened next was dictated by the cold philosophy of the European marriage market in the early 20th century. It was a transaction. On one side stood the American heiresses, the dollar princesses, who had cash but lacked the blue blood history to open doors. On the other stood the European aristocrats who boasted titles dating back to the Crusades, but lived in leaking castles with empty bank accounts. It was a simple supply and demand equation. The Americans bought titles, and the Europeans bought roof repairs. Precedents were already set, such as Consuelo Vanderbilt marrying the Duke of Marlborough to save Blenheim Palace, and Jenny Jerome marrying Lord Randolph Churchill. But Nancy's ambition was higher. She didn't just want a duke or a lord. She had $40 million. She could afford something better. She set her sights on royalty, not just aristocracy, but the blood of kings. However, there was a catch. Most reigning royal families had strict laws against morganatic marriages. A prince could not marry a commoner, especially an American widow, without losing his rights. Nancy needed a prince who was desperate enough to ignore the rules, or a royal family that was so broken they couldn't afford to have rules anymore. Enter the Greeks. The scene of the crime, or the romance, depending on your cynicism, was Biarritz, France. Biarritz was the playground of the elite. It was neutral ground where exiled kings, wealthy Americans, and Russian Grand Dukes mingled by the sea. It was here, around 1914, that Nancy Leeds met Prince Christopher of Greece and Denmark. Prince Christopher was the perfect target. The youngest son of King George I of Greece. He was tall, charming, balding, and perpetually broke. He was a minor royal. He was never going to be king. His role in life was to look good in a uniform and be charming at dinner parties. But Christopher had a problem. The Greek royal family was unstable. They were constantly being exiled, reinstated, and exiled again. He lived on an allowance that was shrinking every year. He was a prince with expensive tastes and a pauper's wallet. When he met Nancy, he saw the answer to his prayers. But what did Nancy see? She saw a man who was related to almost every monarch in Europe. His father was the King of Greece. His sister was the mother of the Duke of Kent. His nephew was the future Duke of Edinburgh. His cousins were the Tsar of Russia and the King of England. To Nancy, the girl from Zanesville, Ohio, Christopher wasn't a man. He was a key. He was the key that would unlock the golden door of the Almanac de Gotha. If she married him, she wouldn't just be Mrs. Leeds anymore. She would be Her Royal Highness. She would be the Aunt of Kings. But we must pause to analyze the true nature of this relationship. Was it love? In his memoirs, Prince Christopher writes fondly of Nancy. He describes her intelligence, her kindness. And Nancy was reportedly charmed by Christopher's lack of pretension. He was funny. He didn't take himself too seriously. But the drama-filled contradiction is undeniable. Nancy was 10 years older than Christopher. She was a widow with a grown son. He was a bachelor prince in his late 20s. In the eyes of society, this was a grotesque mismatch. Why would a young prince marry a middle-aged American widow? There was only one answer: the money. Society labeled Christopher a gigolo and Nancy a social climber. Even if there was genuine affection, the transaction overshadowed the emotion. The world refused to see them as lovers. It only saw them as business partners. Nancy was buying a title. Christopher was selling his birthright. The path to the altar was not smooth. When Christopher first proposed in 1914, the royal family slammed the door. King Constantine I forbade the marriage. Why? Because Nancy was a commoner, because she was an American, because she was a widow. It violated the laws of the royal house. They told Christopher, "You can marry her, but you must renounce your title and your place in the succession." Christopher hesitated. He wasn't ready to give up being a prince, so they waited. For 6 years, they engaged in a long public courtship. This period was crucial for Nancy's humiliation arc. She was the mistress in waiting. She followed the Greek royals around Europe. She stayed in the same hotels, she paid for their dinners, but she was never invited to the official events. She was the woman who paid the bill but had to eat in the kitchen. This period tested her resolve. A weaker woman would have taken her $40 million and found a compliant Italian count. But Nancy was stubborn. She wanted the Greek prince. She wanted the ultimate prize. Her patience was fueled by her fatal weakness, the belief that if she just paid enough eventually, they would have to let her in. This brings us to a fundamental question of value. What is a title worth? To Nancy Stewart, princess was worth more than $40 million. It was worth 6 years of waiting. It was worth the sneers of the newspapers. It was worth the indignity of being the old widow chasing the young prince. She believed that the title had an intrinsic, magical quality that would transmute her base metal origins into gold. She didn't realize that titles are just words, and words change their meaning depending on who is speaking them. To her, princess meant goddess. To the royals she was courting, American princess meant joke. The stage was set. By 1920, the Greek royal family was in dire straits. World War I had ravaged Europe. The Russian Romanovs had been slaughtered. The Greek monarchy was in exile. They were broke. Suddenly, King Constantine's objections to the tin plate heiress began to soften. Morality is often a luxury of the rich. When you are a king living in a hotel room with unpaid bills, principles become flexible. The transaction was about to be approved. Nancy opened her checkbook. Christopher opened the door. And the American widow stepped into the trap. When we imagine a prince, we imagine a man standing on a balcony waving to adoring crowds, backed by a vault full of gold bullion. We do not imagine a man sneaking out the back door of a Swiss hotel because he cannot pay for his laundry. But in 1920, this was the reality for Prince Christopher of Greece. The Greek royal family was not just politically unpopular, they were financially destitute. They were a dynasty of kings and queens who had been evicted from their country, stripped of their income, and left to wander Europe like high-class vagrants. They had the manners of emperors, but the bank accounts of paupers. We are going to look past the medals and the sashes to find the holes in the royal shoes. This is the story of the royal beggar, the man who had to choose between starving with dignity or eating with shame. And he chose to eat. Prince Christopher's willingness to marry a woman 10 years his senior, a woman mocked by the rest of Europe, was not a matter of romance but of survival. The catalyst was the catastrophic fall of the House of Glücksburg. In 1917, at the height of World War I, King Constantine I was forced to abdicate, and the family was expelled from Greece. This was not merely a political change, it was a total eviction. An exiled king loses his civil list, his palaces, and his lands. Without millions stashed in foreign banks, which the Greeks lacked, they became instantly reliant on the charity of relatives. Switzerland in 1917 became their waiting room, expensive, cold, and humiliating. In Athens, servants had dressed them. In Zurich, they counted coins to buy cigarettes. Prince Christopher, raised in the splendor of Tatoi Palace, found his world shrinking to a hotel suite that grew smaller as the savings dwindled. This poverty was the fatal weakness that stripped them of their pride and made them vulnerable. But why were they so poor? Surely they had family money? Here lies the crux of the financial tragedy, the Russian connection. Prince Christopher's mother was Queen Olga of Greece, born Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna of Russia. She was a Romanov. She was the granddaughter of Tsar Nicholas I. For decades, the Greek royal family had been propped up by Russian money. Queen Olga's dowry and her allowance from the Tsar were the financial backbone of the family. Whenever the Greeks ran short, a check would arrive from St. Petersburg. But in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution happened. The Tsar was overthrown and later murdered. The Romanov assets were seized. The flow of rubies and gold from Russia stopped overnight. Queen Olga didn't just lose her family, she lost her fortune. The safety net was gone. Suddenly, Prince Christopher wasn't just a younger son with a small allowance. He was a younger son with no allowance. The family was staring into the abyss of genuine insolvency. They were facing the terrifying prospect of becoming ordinary. Prince Christopher was a complex figure. He occupies a unique space in this story. He is not a villain scheming to steal money. He is a tragic figure trapped by his own upbringing. Christopher was charming. He was a talented pianist. He had a gift for languages, but he had zero survival skills. He had been trained to be a prince. That means he was trained to represent the state, to wear a uniform, and to be a patron of the arts. He was not trained to get a job. In 1920, a prince could not simply become a stockbroker or a lawyer. It was considered infra dignitatem. To work for a wage was to admit that you were no longer royal. So Christopher was trapped in a gilded cage of unemployment. He spent his days playing bridge, visiting other exiled royals, and trying to keep up appearances. But appearances cost money. He needed suits from Savile Row. He needed to tip the porters. He needed to travel first class. He was drowning in debt. His memoirs reveal a man who kept a smile on his face while panic gnawed at his stomach. He describes the humiliation of having to ask friends for loans he knew he couldn't repay. In this context, marriage was not a romantic pursuit. It was a survival strategy. Christopher needed a golden goose, but the European market had crashed. Before WWI, he might have married a German princess or a Russian Grand Duchess. But after the war, the Germans were broke and the Russians were dead. The British royals wouldn't marry him. The only market left with liquidity was America. This is where Nancy Stewart Leeds enters the equation not as a lover, but as a lifeline. Nancy represented the only thing that could save Christopher from total irrelevance: dollars. Hard, cold American cash. Usually in royal marriages, the prince holds the power. But here, the power balance was flipped. Nancy held the checkbook. Christopher held the hat. He was the beggar. She was the benefactor. This dynamic would define their entire relationship. It meant that even though he gave her the title, she owned him. Imagine the internal monologue of Prince Christopher. He was a man of the old world. He valued tradition, bloodlines, and protocol. Nancy was a woman of the new world. She was loud, opinionated, and culturally different. To marry her was to admit defeat. It was an admission that his bloodline was no longer enough to sustain him. He had to sell the one thing that made him special: his royal highness. Their courtship in Biarritz takes on a different light when viewed through this lens. When Nancy paid for dinner, did Christopher feel gratitude or did he feel a sharp pang of emasculation? When she bought him gifts, gold cigarette cases, expensive watches, was it love or was it charity? The transaction was humiliating because it was so public. Everyone in Biarritz knew he was broke. Everyone knew she was rich. They watched the royal beggar dance for his supper. We mentioned in part 1 that King Constantine I initially forbade the marriage. Now we understand why the resistance eventually crumbled. It wasn't because the king suddenly realized Nancy was a wonderful person. It was because the king looked at the ledger. The Greek royal family needed to campaign to get their throne back. Campaigns cost money. They needed to lobby politicians in London and Paris. They needed to print propaganda. They needed to bribe officials. Where was that money coming from? It wasn't coming from the Greek people. It could only come from Nancy. A tacit agreement was formed. Allow Christopher to marry the American, and the American will fund the restoration. Nancy wasn't just marrying a prince, she was funding a counter-revolution. King Constantine's permission, granted in 1920, was essentially a business contract. He sold his brother to save his crown. In a striking inversion of class 1920s, reality trampled the laws of aristocracy. Christopher, though high-born, was the pauper with worn-out shirts living in a guest room. Nancy, though low-born, was the queen of the world with trunks full of furs staying in the royal suite. This disparity shattered the illusion of royal supremacy, proving that blue blood without money is just a biological curiosity. Nancy bought the myth, but in the process, she exposed it as a fraud. She proved that royalty was simply a commodity to be purchased, no more sacred than the tin plates her late husband manufactured. By late 1919, the situation for Christopher was critical. His mother, Queen Olga, was living in Switzerland practically dependent on charity. His pride was gone. He proposed to Nancy formally, but this time it wasn't a maybe, it was a must. He needed to lock down the deal before she changed her mind, or before another destitute prince poached her. Nancy, sensing the desperation, or perhaps ignoring it in favor of her own dreams, accepted. She was buying a distressed asset. In business terms, she was acquiring a luxury brand at a moment of bankruptcy. She got a discount. If the Greek monarchy had been stable, Christopher would never have looked at her. She knew this. He knew this. But they smiled for the cameras anyway. This was the philosophy of the fall. The fall of the European monarchies was not just political. It was existential. It stripped the divine right from kings and left them as men. Prince Christopher represents the tragedy of a man who outlived his own era. He was a relic of the 19th century, trying to survive in the brutal capitalism of the 20th century. He was not equipped for the world of dollars. So he did the only thing he could. He attached himself to someone who was. He became a parasite on the body of American capitalism. It is a harsh judgment, but a necessary one to understand the royal humiliation that followed. Nancy didn't humiliate him by marrying him. The need to marry her was the humiliation. In the world of high-stakes mergers and acquisitions, the year 1920 witnessed a deal that shook the boardrooms of Europe. But this wasn't a merger between two steel companies or two banks. It was a merger between a bank account and a bloodline. On February 1st, 1920, the engagement was officially announced between Prince Christopher of Greece and Mrs. Nancy Stewart Leeds. To the romantic, it was a love match delayed by war. To the cynic, it was the sale of the century. The tin plate heiress was finally closing the deal. She was trading her solitude and her millions for the right to be called Your Royal Highness. But as we open the case file on this specific transaction, we find that it wasn't a simple purchase. It was a negotiation filled with humiliating clauses, public mockery, and a power dynamic so skewed that it doomed the relationship before the ink was even dry. We will look at the pre-nuptial reality, the grotesque age gap that the press feasted upon, and the moment Nancy signed her name on the dotted line, unaware that she was paying for a product that would never truly be hers. The true nature of the transaction reveals itself in the luxury hotels of Biarritz in Switzerland. While the press reported romantic strolls, the reality involved invisible lawyers in the room. Nancy didn't walk into this marriage blindly. She was a shrewd businesswoman who had inherited the instincts of the tin plate king. She knew Christopher was broke. The arrangement, tacit or explicit, was clear. Nancy would settle Christopher's debts and provide him with an allowance to live like a prince. In exchange, Christopher would provide access. He would take her to the palaces, introduce her to Queen Olga, and make her a member of the most exclusive club on earth. But there was a crucial clause in this unwritten contract: political funding. As we touched on in Part 2, the Greek royal family was in exile. They needed a war chest to reclaim the throne. Nancy's fortune was effectively leveraged as the campaign fund for the Greek restoration. This shifts the narrative from social climbing to political investment. Nancy wasn't just buying a title, she was buying a stake in a coup d'etat. She was betting that her money could put a king back on a throne, and if it did, her investment would yield the ultimate return. She would be the sister-in-law of a reigning monarch, not just an exiled one. Visually, the couple presented a stark contrast. In 1920, Prince Christopher was 31 years old. He was tall, with the distinctive heavy eyelids of the Greek/Danish royal line. He looked like a prince, a bit soft perhaps, but aristocratic. Nancy was 42. In today's world, an 11-year age gap is negligible. In 1920, it was a chasm. Nancy was a Victorian woman, Christopher was an Edwardian man. She dressed in the heavy beaded styles of the pre-war era. He was a modern jazz-age royal. The press was merciless. Cartoonists drew Nancy as a matronly figure, weighed down by jewelry, dragging a boy prince by the ear. They called it a May-December romance, but with a cruel twist. It wasn't just age, it was mileage. Nancy had buried 2 husbands. She had lived a full life. Christopher had lived in a palace bubble. The dynamic felt less like husband and wife and more like mother and son, or more brutally, patron and artist. This visual mismatch fed the royal humiliation narrative. Every time they appeared together, the subtext was screamed, he wouldn't be with her if she wasn't rich. Nancy had to walk into every room knowing that this was what people were thinking. We must also address the shadow of Nancy's past. The Black Widow rumors didn't disappear. They intensified. Society gossip is vicious. People whispered, how did a girl from Ohio end up with $40 million? 2 husbands dead? How convenient. There was no evidence of foul play, of course. William Leeds died of pneumonia, but the stigma remained. By marrying a prince, Nancy was trying to wash that stigma away with blue blood. But for the royal family, this was terrifying. Queen Olga was a devout Orthodox woman. She was superstitious. The idea of her son marrying a woman followed by death was abhorrent, but the family swallowed their superstition because they were hungry. This is the drama-filled contradiction. The royals believed in omens and bloodlines, yet they invited the Black Widow into their bed because she brought the checkbook. They compromised their spiritual beliefs for material survival. The most significant barrier to the transaction was Queen Olga. She was a Romanov Grand Duchess. She had witnessed the assassination of her grandfather. She had lost her husband, King George I, to an assassin's bullet in 1913. She had lost her Russian family to the Bolsheviks. She was a woman made of steel and sorrow. She viewed Nancy not just as a commoner, but as a vulgarity. Nancy was loud. She laughed too much. She wore too many diamonds at breakfast. To Olga, who valued understated elegance and rigid protocol, Nancy was a clown. During the engagement period, Olga treated Nancy with ice-cold politeness. This is a specific form of royal torture. It is not shouting, it is not rudeness. It is looking through someone. It is speaking to them only when necessary and using words that are grammatically correct but emotionally dead. Nancy, with her fatal weakness, tried desperately to win Olga over. She bought gifts. She made donations to Olga's charities. But you cannot buy a Romanov. Olga took the money for the charities, but she withheld her affection. Nancy realized that the transaction included the title, but it did not include the love of the family. That was explicitly excluded from the deal. The transaction had a spiritual cost as well. To marry a Greek prince, Nancy had to convert to Greek orthodoxy. Nancy was likely a Protestant. For a woman of 40 to change her religion is a significant act. It means renouncing the faith of your fathers, the faith you raised your son in. It was where the Romanov survivors, the exiled Habsburgs, and the displaced Greeks huddled together, waiting for the world to come to its senses and invite them back. The wedding took place in a small Russian Orthodox church. The vivid visuals are stark. Outside, the gray freezing fog of Lake Geneva. Inside, the heavy smell of incense, the glitter of gold icons, and the stifling heat of candles. The guest list was a who's who of the Almanac de Gotha, but they were all formers. Former kings, former queens, former Grand Dukes. Into this assembly of ghosts walked Nancy Stewart. She was the only one in the room with a future, because she was the only one with a bank account. But as she walked down the aisle, she wasn't walking as a conqueror. She was walking as a supplicant. She was entering their world on their terms, playing by their rules. Even as a bride, Nancy defied convention. Nancy was 42 years old. In 1920, 42 was considered matronly. Yet she was a bride. She wore a dress that reportedly cost a fortune. Heavy lace, diamonds, pearls. She was dripping with wealth. But there is a tragedy in her appearance. She was overcompensating. A born princess would have worn simple silk and a family tiara. Nancy wore everything she had. She was trying to armor herself in luxury to deflect the criticism of her birth. She looked less like a bride and more like a walking treasury. The European aristocrats in the pews likely whispered behind their fans. They saw the dress not as beautiful, but as vulgar. Look at how hard she tries, they would say. Her fatal weakness, the desire for legitimacy, manifested in this excessive display. She thought that if she shone bright enough, they wouldn't notice she was American. She was wrong. The brightness only highlighted the difference. Before the wedding could happen, the erasure began with the soul. Nancy had to convert to Greek orthodoxy. This is not a casual administrative change. The Orthodox conversion ritual is intense. It involves renouncing one's former errors, spitting on the devil, and total submission to the church. Imagine Nancy, a pragmatic American Protestant, kneeling on the stone floor. She had to recite creeds in a language she barely understood. She had to kiss the icons. She had to be chrismated. One must ask, did she believe it? There is no evidence Nancy was particularly religious. This was a transactional conversion. She swapped her God for their God because their God came with a title. But to the devout Queen Olga, this was serious business. Olga watched like a hawk. If Nancy flinched, if she looked bored, it would be an insult to the Romanov ancestors. Nancy performed perfectly. She was a good actress, but in doing so she severed the spiritual link to her own past. She was cutting the anchor to Ohio. The most brutal act of the erasure was the renaming. Why did they change her name? Nancy is a diminutive of Anne or Agnes. In the early 20th century, it was a common name. It sounded friendly, domestic, American. It did not sound royal. You cannot have Her Royal Highness Princess Nancy. It sounded like a character in a musical comedy. The royal family decided she needed a name that carried weight, a name that echoed the Byzantine Empire. They chose Anastasia. It means resurrection. But the irony is that it marked a death. When Christopher turned to her and called her Anastasia for the first time, he was effectively telling her, the woman I fell in love with is not good enough for my family. You must be someone else. Psychologically, this is devastating. Our names are the core of our identity. To lose one's name at 42 is a trauma. Nancy accepted it with a smile. She signed her letters Anastasia. She ordered stationery with A embossed on it. But who was Anastasia? Anastasia was a fiction, a mask. Nancy Stewart was the woman who built the fortune. Anastasia was just the woman spending it. By accepting the name, she accepted that her money was welcome, but she was not. The wedding ceremony itself was a collision of worlds. Prince Christopher wore his uniform, laden with medals of a dissolved kingdom. Queen Olga stood by, the matriarch in mourning black. The air was thick with nostalgia for a lost world. The guests were not celebrating a marriage. They were mourning an era. Nancy was the only modern element in the room. She represented the 20th century, capitalism, industry, America. The royals looked at her with a mixture of hunger and disgust. They needed her, but they resented needing her. The drama-filled contradiction was palpable. The bride was the most powerful person in the room, yet she was the most submissive. She curtsied to people whose hotel bills she was secretly paying. She lowered her head to queens who had lost their thrones. It was a theater of the absurd. As they stood at the altar, the age gap became the elephant in the room. Christopher looked boyish. Nancy looked mature. The royal humiliation narrative was written in that moment. The press would later caption the photos with veiled insults. Prince Christopher and his wealthy bride, the American mother of the Greek prince. Nancy surely felt this. A woman knows when she is being judged for her age. She knew Christopher loved her, but she also knew that if she were poor, he would be marrying a 19-year-old duchess. She was buying affection, and in the eyes of the European court, she was a cradle snatcher. The wedding didn't look like a romance. It looked like an adoption. After the wedding, the couple traveled. They didn't go to a quiet cottage. They went to the grand hotels of Europe. This is where the erasure hit reality. Nancy was now Her Royal Highness. Hotel staff bowed. Passports were stamped with diplomatic immunity. She had achieved the dream. But the reality was hollow. She realized that being a princess meant loss of freedom. She couldn't just go for a walk. She couldn't laugh loudly in the lobby. She couldn't wear comfortable clothes. She had to be on all the time. She had to embody Anastasia. Christopher, having secured the bag, relaxed. He returned to his gambling, his bridge games, his royal gossip. He was back in his element. Nancy was the outsider trying to learn the lines of a play everyone else had memorized at birth. She found that the crown she bought was heavy, sharp, and gave her a headache. Back home, the erasure of Nancy was met with mockery. The American newspapers refused to call her Anastasia. They called her Princess Tin Plate. They called her the Dollar Princess. They highlighted the transaction. Nancy Leeds gives up liberty for a coronet. This hurt her. She wanted to be admired by her countrymen. She wanted to be the American girl who made good. Instead, she was the American girl who sold out. By changing her name and religion, she had alienated her base. She was no longer American enough for the Americans, and she would never be Greek enough for the Greeks. She was a woman without a country. It brings to mind the philosophical paradox of the ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank of a ship, is it still the same ship? If you change a woman's name, her religion, her nationality, and her status, is she still the same woman? The Greek royal family hoped the answer was no. They wanted the old Nancy to disappear, but you cannot erase the past. Nancy Stewart was still in there, trapped beneath the diamonds and the heavy brocade of Princess Anastasia. And the conflict between Nancy and Anastasia would tear her apart. She had successfully bought the prince. She had successfully staged the wedding. But now she had to face the hardest part of the deal. She had to enter the drawing rooms of the European queens and convince them that she wasn't just a walking checkbook. She was about to face the wall of ice. There is a weapon in the arsenal of the European aristocracy that is far more deadly than a guillotine and far more precise than a firing squad. It is called etiquette. When Nancy Stewart, now Princess Anastasia, entered the drawing rooms of the exiled Greek royal family, she expected a fairy tale. She expected gratitude. She expected to be embraced as the savior of the dynasty. Instead, she walked into a freezer. She was met with a wall of silence so thick it could stop a bullet. They didn't spit on her. They didn't scream at her. They simply refused to see her. To the queens and grand duchesses of the old world, Nancy was a biological error. She was a dollar princess, a creature made of cash and crude oil, trying to pass herself off as a creature of blood and history. It is the autopsy of the social torture inflicted on a woman who thought she could buy her way into the most exclusive club on earth, only to find that the members had changed the locks. Nancy's tragedy was fueled by the invisible machinery of royal snobbery. It was not overt bullying, but microaggression operating on codes that Nancy, the girl from Ohio, did not understand. Code 1, volume. Aristocrats speak in hushed, modulated tones. They do not emote. Nancy was American and enthusiastic. In a quiet Swiss hotel drawing room, her normal speaking voice sounded like a foghorn. Every time she laughed, the room would go silent. The eyes of the other women would dart to each other in a silent telegraphy of disdain. Listen to her. She sounds like a fishwife. Nancy likely interpreted this silence as attention, unaware it was judgment. She would tell stories about America and business, only for the royals to listen politely and then pivot immediately to a cousin in Denmark or a castle in Bavaria, topics Nancy knew nothing about. She was systematically excluded from the conversation, even while she was doing most of the talking. The most visible marker of her commonness was her accent. Nancy spoke with the flat, rhotic vowels of the American Midwest. To Prince Christopher, who spoke 5 languages fluently, this might have been charmingly exotic. But to Queen Olga or the other royal relations, the American accent was the sound of the decline of civilization. It was the sound of the new world that was destroying their old world. They mocked her behind her back. They would mimic her pronunciation of words like water or duke. This is a form of class warfare. By focusing on her accent, they delegitimized her intelligence. It didn't matter that Nancy was shrewd enough to manage a steel fortune. Because she didn't sound like them, she was considered stupid. Nancy tried to adapt. She took lessons. She tried to soften her vowels. But the harder she tried, the more unnatural she sounded. She was trapped in a linguistic no man's land, too posh for Ohio, too common for Athens. Visually, the fashion clash was striking. Nancy possessed one of the greatest jewelry collections in the world. She owned the Cartier diamond. She had ropes of pearls, tiaras, and emeralds. And she wore them, all of them. In America, displaying wealth was a sign of success. If you have it, flaunt it. In European royal circles, especially in exile/mourning, displaying wealth was considered vulgar. A born queen wears her jewels with a sense of careless entitlement. She wears them because they are family heirlooms, not because they are expensive. Nancy wore her jewels like armor. She wore them to prove she was worth something. The result was the Christmas tree effect. She glittered too much. At a dinner party where Queen Olga might be wearing a simple black dress with a single strand of pearls, Nancy would arrive dripping in diamonds. She thought she was showing respect to the occasion. The royals thought she was showing off. They looked at her diamonds and saw tin plate. They saw the sweat of the factory workers. They saw the dirty money. This visual contrast made Nancy look smaller, not bigger. It highlighted her insecurity. The true antagonist in this story was Queen Olga. Olga was not a cruel woman by nature. She was a saint to the poor, a nurse to the wounded. But when it came to protocol and bloodlines, she was a tyrant. She accepted Nancy's money for her charities. She allowed Nancy to pay for the family's housing, but she refused to treat Nancy as an equal. The drama-filled contradiction is painful. Nancy desperately wanted a mother figure. She wanted Olga's approval. She would curtsy lower than anyone else. She would kiss Olga's hand with fervor. Olga would offer her hand, limp and cold, and look past Nancy's shoulder. In letters to her other relatives, Olga often referred to Nancy as Christopher's wife or the American, rarely Anastasia, never my daughter. This rejection cut deep. Nancy had bought the prince, but she couldn't buy the matriarch. And in a royal family, if the matriarch doesn't accept you, you are nothing. The dynamic extended beyond the immediate family. All of exiled Europe was broke. Grand dukes, archdukes, and princes flocked to Switzerland. When they saw Nancy, they saw a target. They would be charming to her face. They would kiss her hand. They would invite her to tea. And then, inevitably, the request would come. Could you spare a small loan? Just until my estates in Russia are restored? Nancy, wanting to be liked, almost always said yes. She handed out checks like confetti. But a pattern emerges. Once the check cleared, the invitation stopped. They treated her not as a friend, but as a service provider. She was the ATM of the aristocracy. Nancy wasn't stupid. She knew she was being used. But her fatal weakness trapped her. She reasoned, if I stop paying, they will stop talking to me entirely. At least this way, I am in the room. It was a humiliating calculus. She was paying a subscription fee for fake friendship. What about Prince Christopher? He was caught in the middle. He loved his wife, but he also loved his family. He saw the snobbery. He heard the whispers. He tried to defend her. In his memoirs, he writes protectively of her. He claimed the family loved her, but reading between the lines tells a different story. The fact that he had to write that suggests the opposite was true. There were scenes of awkwardness where Christopher likely had to kick Nancy under the table to stop her from saying something American. He had to translate her loud jokes into softer French. He had to act as her PR manager and her bodyguard. This strained the marriage. Nancy must have felt his embarrassment. There is nothing more corrosive to a relationship than the feeling that your partner is ashamed of you. When she saw him wince at her laugh, a little part of Anastasia died. The philosophical root of this conflict is the concept of taste. Taste is a gatekeeping mechanism. It is arbitrary. Who decides that a loud laugh is bad? Who decides that too many diamonds are vulgar? The people in power decide. The royals used taste to maintain their superiority over the dollar princesses. They had lost their thrones, their armies, and their money. Taste was the only thing they had left, so they weaponized it. They made the rules of taste so complex and subtle that Nancy could never win. If she talked, she was loud. If she was silent, she was dull. If she spent money, she was vulgar. If she didn't, she was stingy. The game was rigged. Nancy was playing chess against opponents who could change the rules every time she moved a piece. Eventually, the couple moved to Palermo and then Rome. Nancy poured her money into creating a royal court for herself. If the other royals wouldn't accept her, she would build her own kingdom. She decorated the villa with exquisite furniture. She hosted lavish parties. But even here, the humiliation followed. The guests who came were the second-tier royals, or the ones who needed money most desperately. The first tier, the ruling monarchs, the strict traditionalists, stayed away. Nancy sat in her golden villa surrounded by sycophants, but she remained isolated. She realized that she had bought the stage setting of a royal life, but the actors were all extras. The stars were missing. Stress kills. Living in a constant state of social anxiety takes a toll on the body. Nancy was a proud woman. She hid her pain. She kept her chin up. She smiled for the photographers. But inside, the rejection was eating her alive. She began to suffer from nerves. She had headaches. She had stomach issues. The tragedy is that her immense wealth could buy any doctor in the world, but no doctor could cure the feeling of not being good enough. She was fighting a battle she couldn't win. She was trying to force a square peg into a round hole. The friction was wearing her down. Nancy was suffering from a unique form of impostor syndrome. Usually this syndrome is internal. We feel like frauds even when we are successful. For Nancy, the imposter syndrome was external. The world told her she was a fraud. Every newspaper article calling her the tin plate princess, every cold stare from Queen Olga, every snicker in the hotel lobby confirmed her deepest fear. I am just a girl from Ohio dressed up in a costume. She had spent millions. She had changed her name. She had prayed to a new god. And the result? She was the richest woman in the room, but she was also the poorest. Because in the economy of respect, she was bankrupt. A throne is usually supported by the loyalty of the people or the strength of an army. But in 1920, the throne of Greece was supported by something else entirely: the bank account of an American widow. Nancy Stewart, now Princess Anastasia, had entered the royal family as a bride, but she quickly became something far more important. She became the golden crutch. The Greek royal family was crippled by exile and debt. They couldn't walk on their own. They needed Nancy to hold them up. She paid for their hotels. She paid for their clothes. She paid for their political campaigns. She was the financial engine that drove the entire dynasty. But here is the dark truth. A crutch is not a limb. It is a tool. You lean on it when you are weak, but you resent it because it reminds you of your weakness. And the moment you are strong enough to walk again, you throw it away. We will see how Nancy's fortune was drained to buy a kingdom for a family that still wouldn't give her a seat at the head of the table. The magnitude of Nancy's contribution is revealed by opening the royal ledger. When Nancy married Christopher in February 1920, the Greek royals were scattered across Switzerland, Italy, and France. King Constantine I, the head of the family, was living in a hotel in Lucerne, a king without a country and, crucially, without a civil list. His entourage was massive, yet his pockets were empty. While officially the king subsisted on private funds, the reality was a cash flow provided by Princess Anastasia. She provided an allowance not just to her husband, Prince Christopher, but quietly subsidized the wider family. One can imagine Nancy sitting at a desk in the Villa Anastasia in Rome, writing checks to the Hotel National in Lucerne, to tailors in London, to jewelers in Paris. She was the sole underwriter of the royal image. Without her money, the facade would have crumbled. The king would have looked like a beggar, the princes like tramps. She bought them the dignity they claimed was their birthright. But paying for hotels was small change compared to the real project, the restoration. In 1920, the political situation in Greece was volatile. The prime minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, was losing popularity. There was a chance, a slim chance, that King Constantine could return. But political comebacks cost money. You need propaganda. You need to print pamphlets. You need to lobby foreign governments. You need to pay spies and messengers to travel between Athens and Switzerland. Where did this black money come from? It came from the tin plate fortune. Nancy became the primary financier of the royalist movement. This transforms her role She wasn't just a social climber, she was a kingmaker. She poured thousands of dollars into the campaign. Why? Because of her fatal weakness, the desire for legitimacy. She reasoned, if I help put Constantine back on the throne, I will no longer be the American widow. I will be the sister-in-law of the king of Greece. I will be a central figure in history. She was buying her way into the history books. In November 1920, a miracle happened. Venizelos lost the elections. A plebiscite was held to bring the king back. The people voted yes. King Constantine was restored. The royal family was jubilant. They packed their trunks. They prepared to return to Athens in triumph. But amidst the popping corks of champagne, the detective asks, how much credit did Nancy get? Publicly? None. Kings do not admit that their throne was bought by American steel. Privately? There was relief, but not gratitude. Gratitude is a heavy burden for royals. It implies equality. If a king is grateful to a commoner, he admits the commoner has power over him. So they treated Nancy's contribution as duty. She married a prince. Therefore, it is her duty to support the house. They framed her generosity as an obligation. This psychological twist allowed them to take her money without giving her their respect. December 1920, the return to Athens. The streets were lined with cheering crowds. The king and queen rode in open carriages. Where was Nancy? She was there, of course. She was Princess Anastasia now. She stood on the balcony of the royal palace. This should have been her moment of triumph. She had made it. She was standing on the balcony of a European capital waving to the masses. But look closer at the drama-filled contradiction. She was physically there, but spiritually isolated. She didn't speak Greek. She didn't understand the complex politics of the Balkans. She was a tourist in her own kingdom. While the populace cheered for Constantine the Eagle, they looked at Nancy and asked, "Who is the woman with the diamonds?" She was a prop, a well-dressed, expensive prop. She realized that buying the theater ticket doesn't make you part of the cast. Now that the family was back in power, the internal dynamics shifted. Nancy had to interact with the other royal women. Queen Sophie was formidable, Prussian, and stiff. Princess Alice was eccentric, deeply religious, and struggling with deafness. Princess Nicholas was haughty and snobbish. How did they treat Nancy? They used her. Nancy's money refurbished the Tatoi palace. It fixed the plumbing. It bought the cars. But socially, she was still the American. They would accept her invitations to dinner, but they would subtly mock her manners. They would speak in German or Greek when she was in the room, effectively cutting her out of the conversation. Nancy, desperate to please, would just smile and order more champagne. She became the hostess, not the sister. She was the entertainment committee for the House of Glucksburg. Why did Nancy keep paying? Why didn't she close the checkbook when she realized they despised her? This is the sunk cost fallacy. She had already invested so much, her name, her religion, her millions. To stop now would be to admit failure. To stop now would mean losing the prince. If she cut off the funds, Christopher might leave her, or the family might ostracize her completely. She was trapped in a cycle of paying for attention. She thought, maybe the next check will make them love me. Maybe if I buy a new villa for the king, Queen Sophie will finally call me by my first name. It was an addiction. She was addicted to the hope of acceptance. Being a crutch is exhausting. You bear the weight of others. Nancy was not a young woman anymore. She was in her mid-40s. The stress of the restoration, the travel, the constant social performance, and the financial pressure began to wear her down. She was the fixer. When Christopher got into gambling debt, Nancy fixed it. When the king needed a secret invoice sent to London, Nancy funded it. She was carrying the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. And unlike Atlas, she didn't have the strength of a god. She had the frailty of a human woman. Her health began to falter. This is the beginning of the tragedy. Just as she reached the summit of her ambition, her body began to betray her. It was as if the life force was being sucked out of her along with the dollars. By 1921 to 1922, the shine had worn off the crown. The political situation in Greece turned sour again. The disastrous Asia Minor campaign was going badly. The king was unpopular again. Nancy realized that she had bought a lemon. The kingdom she had funded was collapsing. The golden crutch was buckling under the weight of political disaster. She saw the fear in Christopher's eyes. They might be exiled again. Imagine the bitterness. She had spent millions to put them on the throne, and they had squandered it in less than 2 years. She began to see the royals not as gods, but as incompetent managers. A shift appears in her letters. The enthusiasm fades. A cynical tone creeps in. She realized she had been sold a dream that was actually a nightmare of instability. The dynamic had become parasitic. The Greek royal family became parasitic on Nancy Stewart. But parasites often resent their hosts. It is a psychological defense mechanism. To admit you need someone is to admit you are weak. So the royals protected their egos by despising the source of their sustenance. They told themselves, "She is lucky to be allowed to pay for us. We are giving her the privilege of serving history." This twisted logic allowed them to sleep at night while spending her tin plate money. Nancy, on the other hand, learned the hard lesson of philanthropy without love. Money creates dependency, but it kills intimacy. You can't be friends with your payroll. She was the golden crutch, essential, expensive, and ultimately unloved. There is a cruel joke at the heart of the human condition. You can spend a lifetime climbing the mountain, but once you reach the summit, you might find that the air is too thin to breathe. Nancy Stewart, Princess Anastasia of Greece, had reached the peak. She was a royal highness. She was the sister-in-law of a king. She was the wealthiest woman in the Almanac de Gotha. She had defeated the American press. She had defeated the snobbish queens of Europe. She had defeated poverty. But in 1921, just 1 year after her triumph, she faced an enemy that couldn't be bribed, charmed, or married. It started as a pain, a fatigue, a shadow on a doctor's face, cancer. The dollar princess had bought everything in the world, except time. It is the tragedy of a woman who spent 40 years striving for a title she would only get to enjoy for 3. It is the story of how the golden crutch finally snapped, not under the weight of the Greek monarchy, but under the weight of her own mortality. The tragedy unfolded on a strict schedule. 1920 was a year of adrenaline, defined by the wedding and the restoration. 1921 became the year of the crash. As King Constantine fought a disastrous war in Turkey, funded by Nancy's checkbook, Nancy fought a silent, losing war within her own body. Photos from late 1921 reveal a haunting transformation. The plump figure mocked by the press was rapidly melting away. She likely attributed the weight loss to the relentless stress of court life and constant social performance, ignoring the lethal symptoms. This was her fatal weakness manifesting physically. She was so obsessed with maintaining her position that she neglected her survival. In her mind, a sick princess was a useless princess, a burden. So she masked her pallor with rouge and used diamonds to distract from her thinning frame. Eventually, the pain became impossible to ignore. She consulted specialists. In the 1920s, oncology was in its infancy. The word cancer was whispered, rarely spoken aloud. It was a dirty word, almost as taboo as bankruptcy. The diagnosis was delivered: It was likely colon or stomach cancer, painful, slow, and incurable by the standards of the day. Imagine the moment the doctor told her. Nancy was a negotiator. She was a businesswoman. Her instinct would have been to ask, how much? How much for the best surgeon? How much for the new radium treatment? How much to make this go away? But for the first time in her life, her checkbook was useless. The cancer didn't care about the price of tin. It didn't care that she was a princess. This is the philosophical horror, the realization that biology is the ultimate communist. It treats the queen and the peasant exactly the same. For a woman who had built her entire identity on the power of money, this was a psychological shattering. Greece was too chaotic. The medical facilities were not good enough. Nancy needed the best. She moved to London. She rented Spencer House. The scene at Spencer House was poignant. Spencer House is one of the grandest aristocratic mansions in London. It is a palace. Nancy rented it. Even in death, she had to live in grandeur. She turned Spencer House into the most luxurious hospital ward in history. She filled it with flowers. She filled it with servants. But it was a golden cage. Outside, London was roaring with the jazz age. Inside, the curtains were drawn. Prince Christopher stayed with her. This was his test. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a nurse. He was a prince. But to his credit, Christopher didn't run. He stayed. However, the dynamic had shifted again. He was no longer the royal beggar. He was the royal widower in waiting. And Nancy knew it. Christopher's mindset was equally complex. He loved Nancy. His memoirs are filled with genuine grief, but we must also look at the practicalities. Nancy was the bank. If Nancy died, what happened to the money? Did he panic? The Greek royal family was still in exile. They were desperate. If Nancy died without securing their future, they would be back on the street. So, beneath the grief, there was a layer of self-preservation. Christopher had to ensure that he remained in her good graces until the very end. He had to be the perfect husband. This adds a layer of tragedy to their interactions. When he held her hand, was he comforting her, or was he clinging to his lifeline? Nancy, sharp as ever even through the morphine, likely wondered the same thing. Does he cry for me, or for the lifestyle I provide? How did the rest of the family react? Queen Olga, King Constantine, the others. They sent telegrams. Praying for you. Get well soon. But they didn't flock to London. Why? Partly because of the war in Greece, but partly because illness is ugly. Royalty is about projection of strength. Sickness is weakness. They distanced themselves from the dying American. It was uncomfortable. It reminded them that their golden crutch was made of flesh and bone, and it was breaking. There is a profound humiliation in this abandonment. When she was writing checks, they were at her dinner table. Now that she was dying, she was left to the nurses. They treated her like a broken appliance. It's a shame the ATM is out of order. Cancer is a humiliating disease. It strips away dignity. Nancy Stewart was a vain woman. She took pride in her appearance. She loved fashion. Now she was wasting away. Her clothes didn't fit. Her hair thinned. Her skin turned gray. For a woman who had fought so hard to present herself as regal, this physical decay was a torture. She refused to see visitors. She didn't want the snobs to see her like this. She wanted them to remember Princess Anastasia in her tiara, not Nancy Stewart in a bedpan. She was trying to curate her own legacy even as she was losing her mind to the pain. She maintained the protocol of the dying monarch. She ordered the servants to maintain standards. The silver must be polished. The flowers must be fresh. She was staging her death like a royal event. As death approached, Nancy turned her attention to the one thing she could still control, her will. This document is the key to the entire story. Nancy had a son, William Leeds Jr. She loved him. He was her flesh and blood, but she also had a husband, Prince Christopher, and she had a duty to the royal family she had bought into. This created a profound conflict. Should she leave the money to her son or to her husband? She split it, but she was incredibly generous to Christopher. She left him enough money to live like a king for the rest of his life. She left him the Villa Anastasia in Rome. She left him jewels. She left him cash. Why? Was it love? Or was it the final payment on the contract? She wanted to ensure that she would be remembered as the savior of the dynasty. She was buying her immortality. By making Christopher rich, she ensured that the name Anastasia would be spoken with reverence in the royal courts for decades. It was her final act of American dollar diplomacy. August 1923. Nancy was 45 years old. She had been a princess for 3 years and 6 months. Most of that time had been spent fighting for acceptance or fighting for her life. She had enjoyed perhaps 6 months of actual unburdened happiness. The cost-benefit analysis of her life was tragic. She paid $40 million for 6 months of joy. In her final hours, Christopher sat by her bed. He held a candle. Did she revert to being Nancy in those final moments? Did she call out for Ohio? Or did she die as Anastasia? The records say she died peacefully, but the context screams of unfinished business. She died knowing that she never really arrived. She died in transit. She was a tourist who ran out of time before she could see the main attraction. There is a subplot here involving her son, William Leeds Jr. While Nancy was dying, William Jr. was falling in love with whom? With Princess Xenia of Russia. Who was Xenia? She was the niece of Prince Christopher, the granddaughter of King George I. Nancy's son was marrying Nancy's husband's niece. The tin plate family and the royal family were merging completely. Nancy lived just long enough to see this engagement. This was her victory. She hadn't just bought a title for herself. She had bought one for her son. Her grandchildren would be Romanov descendants. The blood of the tin mines would mix with the blood of the czars. She died, knowing that the biological merger she dreamed of had finally happened, not through her, but through her son. It was a dynastic triumph, even if she wasn't there to see it. This brings us to the concept of ownership. Nancy thought she owned the world, but we own nothing. We only rent our time. She rented the title of princess. It was a short lease. The tragedy of the American dollar princess is the tragedy of materialism, meeting mortality. We build castles of stone, but we inhabit bodies of paper. Nancy's death exposed the lie of the Gilded Age. That money can solve the human problem. It cannot. It can only decorate the problem. She died in a silk bedsheet, but she was just as dead as the workers in her husband's tin mills. The royal humiliation continued to the very end. She died trying to be something she wasn't, for people who didn't care, using money she couldn't take with her. In the end, we all own the same amount of land, about 6 feet. Nancy Stewart, Princess Anastasia of Greece, spent 45 years accumulating a fortune that could buy cities. She bought steel mills, she bought mansions on Fifth Avenue, she bought a villa in Rome, and finally she bought a prince. But on August 29, 1923, the ledger was closed. The dollar princess was dead. Her body was transported from London to Greece. She was buried in the royal cemetery at Tatoi, among the kings and queens she had paid to save. She finally had her permanent seat at the table, but as the earth covered her coffin, the dark truth of the transaction became clear. The money didn't die with her. It stayed above ground. It flowed into the pockets of the husband who would remarry a real princess. It flowed into the coffers of a family that would continue to struggle for another 50 years. This final chapter is the verdict on the American princess. We will trace the path of the inheritance, witness the speed with which she was replaced, and answer the ultimate question. Did she buy a legacy, or did she just pay for the world's most expensive funeral? A will is not just a legal document, it is a declaration of values. Nancy left the bulk of her fortune to her son, William Leeds Jr. This was expected, but she was extraordinarily generous to Prince Christopher. She didn't have to be. She could have left him a token amount. She could have tied the money up in trusts. Instead, she gave him freedom. She left him the Villa Anastasia in Rome. She left him enough capital to ensure he would never have to be a royal beggar again. Why? Was it love? Yes, undoubtedly. But it was also pride. Nancy wanted to ensure that the man who carried her name lived in splendor. She was projecting her image from beyond the grave. Every time Christopher threw a lavish party in the 1920s, every time he wore a new Savile Row suit, he was a walking billboard for the Leeds fortune. She turned him into a living monument to her generosity. The tragedy is that by making him financially independent, she also made him independent of her memory. He didn't need to mourn her to survive. He was free to move on. The funeral took place in Athens. It was a royal affair. Nancy was buried in the royal cemetery at Tatoi Palace. This is a significant location. It is the private burial ground of the Greek dynasty. By burying her there, the family fulfilled their end of the contract. They admitted her into the inner sanctum. She lies near King George I, near King Constantine I. But the imagery of Tatoi is haunting. It is a forest cemetery. The graves are simple crosses. It is quiet, isolated. Nancy, the woman who loved the noise of New York, the lights of Paris, and the parties of London, was laid to rest in a silent Greek forest she barely knew. She is surrounded by people who, in life, mocked her accent and spent her money. Do the ghosts of the old world accept the ghost of the new world? Or is she just as isolated in the ground as she was in the drawing room? She achieved her goal. She is undeniably, permanently a princess of Greece. But looking at the cold stone, one wonders if the view was worth the climb. Prince Christopher was genuinely heartbroken. He wrote of his grief, but Christopher was a prince, and princes have duties, and princes get lonely. In 1929, just 6 years after Nancy's death, Christopher remarried. And who did he marry? Princess Françoise of Orléans. This is the ultimate royal humiliation. Françoise was the daughter of the Duke of Guise. She was blue blood royalty. She was a Bourbon Orléans. She was everything Nancy was not: European, Catholic, and born into the purple. She wasn't rich. But Christopher didn't need a rich wife anymore. Why? Because Nancy had made him rich. Nancy's money paid for the second marriage. Nancy's fortune allowed Christopher to marry for class instead of cash. She was the starter wife who built the foundation so the royal wife could move into the penthouse. This is a brutal reality of dynastic survival. Nancy was the fuel. Françoise was the passenger. The fuel is burned up to get the car moving, and then it is forgotten. What happened to the millions? The tin-plate fortune watered the dry fields of the Greek monarchy for decades. In the 1920s and 30s, the Greek royals were exiled again. They lived in London, Paris, and Rome. How did they survive? Partly through the remaining Leeds money. Christopher was known as one of the few solvent members of the family. He helped his relatives. Nancy's dollars paid for the education of young princes. It paid for the dowries of princesses. It is not an exaggeration to say that Princess Anastasia saved the dignity of the House of Greece. Without her, they would have been reduced to selling their medals, like the Romanovs in Paris driving taxis. But did they name a wing of a palace after her? Did they build a hospital in her name? Number. The money was absorbed quietly, like water into a sponge. The erasure continued. They spent the money, but they stopped talking about the source. It was considered unseemly to remind everyone that their lifestyle was funded by American tin. The story has a strange twist involving Nancy's son, William Leeds Jr. While Nancy died young, her son achieved the dream she had died for. He married Princess Xenia of Russia. This marriage was different. They were young, they were rich, and they were glamorous. William Leeds Jr. lived the life his mother craved. He sailed the world on a yacht. He lived among kings. Through him, the Leeds DNA entered the bloodstream of the European aristocracy. Nancy's grandchildren were half Russian royalty. In a biological sense, Nancy won. Her descendants were no longer commoners. They were the elite. But William Jr. eventually divorced Xenia. The money and the titles couldn't hold the marriage together. It proved once again the drama-filled contradiction. You can buy the wedding, but you can't buy the marriage. The Leeds curse of unhappy richness seemed to follow the money. How is Nancy remembered today? If you look at the official history of the Greek royal family, she is there. But she is a footnote. She is listed as Christopher's first wife. There are few anecdotes about her wit, her intelligence, or her business acumen. She is defined solely by her utility. She is remembered as the rich American. This is the final humiliation. To be remembered not for who you were, but for what you owned. She is an object lesson in the history of the Gilded Age. She represents the era when America was conquering the world economically, but Europe still held the cultural high ground. She threw herself against the wall of ice and she broke herself. But in breaking, she made a crack that allowed others to slip through. After Nancy, the idea of royals marrying Americans became slightly less shocking. She paved the way for Wallace Simpson and Grace Kelly. She was the pioneer of the royal commoner merger, but pioneers usually die with arrows in their backs. Let us return to the central question. Was it a fair trade? Nancy gave $40 million, her name, her religion, her health, and her life. She received the title HRH Princess Anastasia, a coat of arms, 3 years of royal status, and a grave at Tatoi. From a purely business perspective, it was a terrible deal. The ROI was negative. But humans do not operate on logic. We operate on desire. Nancy desired validation. She wanted to prove to the snobs of New York and the ghosts of Ohio that she was somebody. And in the rigid, class-obsessed world of 1920, the only way to prove you were somebody was to have a title. She died believing she had won. And perhaps for her, that belief was worth the price. She died before the money ran out. She died before she could be divorced or discarded. She died at the height of her illusion. Maybe that is a form of mercy. The final verdict is this. Princess Anastasia was a victim of a mutual scam. She scammed the royals into thinking she was one of them. They scammed her into thinking they respected her. They were both pretending. But the royals won the long game. They took the cash and kept their prestige. Nancy lost the game. She lost her life. The royal humiliation was total. She was the golden goose that was cooked and eaten. And when the feast was over, the royals wiped their mouths with silk napkins and went back to speaking French, leaving the empty plate and the empty woman behind. And that is the dark, glittering, and ultimately tragic truth about Nancy Stewart, the American princess who bought a Greek prince. She was the tin plate heiress who saved a dynasty but lost herself. Her life is a brutal reminder that you can buy a crown, but you cannot buy the respect of the people who wear them. She lies today in the forest of Tatoi, surrounded by kings who mocked her, paid for by the fortune she left behind. Her story forces us to ask, what is the price of dignity? Is it worth $40 million to be called Your Highness by people who despise you? Nancy thought so, but history suggests she made a bad deal. If this deep dive into the world of dollar princesses and royal humiliation fascinated you, please leave a like and subscribe. We expose the stories the palaces try to hide. Tell me in the comments, do you think Nancy was a victim, or did she get exactly what she paid for? This is your channel name. Thank you for watching The American Princess. Rest in peace, Nancy. The transaction is closed.